So the aggregate supply curve is the measurement of the amount of output of a certain good that is made based on the price level that they get from that good being sold. And there's two types of aggregate supply curve. There's the short run aggregate supply curve and the long run aggregate supply curve. So the short run aggregate supply curve shows a positive relationship between the output of a good based on its price. So as the price of a final good goes up, then the output of it is going to go up, as they have a higher ratio of money spent on making that good. So as the price of something goes up, then companies are more incentivized to produce more of that good, as the amount of money that they're spending on making the good is more worth it, as the price that they're getting from that good is going up. And since the price to produce something is a long run change in price, then that change doesn't really come into effect, guys.
In the short run.
In the short run. That word. Another way the short run aggregate supply curve can shift is through the new development of technology. So if a new technology is developed to make production more efficient, then the supply curve will shift to the right, as they'll be more efficient and they can create more of that said good. Then the supply curve can also shift if they expect the price of a good to go up, or if they expect the prices of goods to go down. So if they're expecting the price of the final good to go down, then they'll produce less, and so the supply curve will shift to the left. But if they expect it to go up, then they'll want to produce more, and so the aggregate supply curve will shift to the right. One last way that the short run aggregate supply curve can be shifted is by an increase or decrease in wages. When wages are considered a long run change or a long run price change, and so when wages are changed, then if the wages are going up, then the companies have to pay their employees more for working, and so their price to produce things goes up, and so the supply curve, the short run aggregate supply curve, would shift to the left, since they have to produce less. Then if wages were to fall, then the short run aggregate supply curve would shift to the right, because they have to pay their workers less, and so they don't have to pay their workers as much, and so they're spending less money on producing goods. So the long run aggregate supply curve is a straight up and down line on the graph, as long run changes in something like wages have less impact on how much they're going to produce in how much the company is going to produce of a good. So if the price, since wages, which is something that the long run aggregate supply curve represents, are considered sticky, they don't shift with the short run aggregate supply curve, since it takes a longer time for those changes in wages to happen. And so when the price level of something goes up, the output isn't going to change that much until the wages or something like the production cost changes.
The topic I will be covering is the long-run aggregate supply versus the short-run aggregate supply and demand. Over here on the right, we have an inflationary gap, because your demand is higher than your long-run aggregate supply, and when equivalent to your short-run aggregate supply, which basically that means that there's more wanted of the good than is being produced, which is allowed by the income, because the long-run aggregate supply, which would be income, if I can grab my marker here, would be Y, which is income. This is only how much, this is the amount that people are being paid, and this is well in front of that line, so they can only buy as much as they're able to based off their income. That's why this is an inflationary gap. Ciao. This over here is a recession. I know I went in the wrong order. I went A, C, B, but who cares? B over here, this would be a recession because your demand is low and your supply is low. So your total price level is quite low and your total output / real GDP is also much lower than your income or how much employees are being paid. Therefore, they have more total money, which means that the employees having more money makes the companies want to employ less people because they don't have to pay quite as much for their goods and they're still being paid the same. Therefore, unemployment raises.
So today I'm going to be talking about 2 MCQs that will probably help you with understanding aggregate supply and how aggregate supply kind of shifts. So for this question, we have which of the following would not cause a shift in the short run aggregate supply curve? Now, if you were watching the previous 2 videos, my previous partners explained aggregate supply and how the curve works. And so you should probably be able to guess that we will have to know which one of these will shift the aggregate supply curve and which of these will not. And so recognizing which will make it a lot easier to recognize which will not. So let's look at the 4 possible answers. So first we have cost of labor increases. Now, as we know, the cost of labor will cost production to increase, right? Sorry, not increase, but the price of the production to increase. And so we know that the cost of labor would probably shift the supply curve to the left. So it would cause a supply shift, right? And so we can look at, let's say, answer C. All right, so we see new technology makes production more efficient. Now, as we know, it's kind of similar to cost of labor, except in the opposite direction, because now it makes production easier. And so there will be more supply, and so it will shift the supply curve to the right. And then for a final one, unemployment rising, it shifts it to the left because, there will be less workers, right? And so there will be less supply. And so that's out. So we have A, C, and D that are out. And so all we have left is change in final price of a good or service. Now, you may be wondering, why wouldn't that shift it? Well, I think it would only shift it on the curve itself. It would not actually shift the curve itself. It would only shift where the point is on the graph. And so this would not cause a shift in the aggregate supply. So we know that our answer is B, as in change in final price of a good or service. So for the next MCQ, we're going to be doing this one. So it says, based on the graph, what state is this economy in? A, an inflationary gap, B, a long-run equilibrium, C, a recessionary gap, or D, a mental breakdown. Now, we could go all over like what these answers mean and what it's even talking about, but basically what we can infer from this graph is that this point in which the aggregate demand and aggregate supply intersect is the equilibrium. And so what we can infer from this is that when the equilibrium is to the left of the long-run aggregate supply curve, it is a recessionary gap. And when the equilibrium point is on the right of the long-run aggregate supply, that's an inflationary gap. So the only 2 that have those is A and C. And as we can see from the graph, the equilibrium point is to the left of the long-run aggregate supply curve. So therefore, it is a recessionary gap, and therefore it is C.